Forgiveness. This is our series for Lent, learning to let go. Our sermon today is on forgiving, the process of forgiving. Forgiving is seeing others the way that God sees them. Forgiveness is kind of a tricky topic. Because for some reason, it is not only one of the most challenging things that any of us can do as humans, not only one of the most difficult and somewhat confusing things, but also because it seems to be what is most called for at this present time in history, in our communities, in our families, maybe even as a species, that we are now being invited into this murky, sometimes dark and mysterious terrain of forgiveness, which also happens to be one of the largest themes and topics in the Bible. One of the central themes in all of the Gospels is forgiveness. Forgiveness has the word give in it as well. It's this charitable act of generosity in response to a grace and a mercy that we don't often understand. Forgiving has a lot to do with seeing others. This whole notion of seeing we find all throughout the Bible, from Genesis to the Gospel of John, around this image, this theme of light. Light. Light has everything to do not only with what is seen, but in how we see it. So our sermon today is going to really address this huge perspective shift in how we understand forgiveness, and also how we might go about beginning the process of forgiveness in our own lives. How does God see other people? How do you think God sees those people that maybe are forgotten, that we don't typically see? Have you ever thought of that? Think about all the different types of people in the world from all different stations of life, and how narrow our bandwidth is of the people that we do see, right? How do you imagine that God sees other people who live differently than you, who believe differently, people of different socioeconomic classes that we don't often run into every day? How does God see others? It kind of also calls into question, how do we see others, right? Like, do we see each other as an object or a stereotype or a project to fix? How do we see others? Do we see others in the fullness of their personality? All the intricacies of their stories that have shaped them since childhood. Historical events that have shaped them. How do we see other people? Do we see other people as primarily wounded? Or do we see them as whole? I thought these questions are good to ask in light of the season of Lent. Because Lent is really a season for asking questions, a season for unknown. In some ways, God invites us through Lent to see things differently. That's why we practice letting go. I don't know, how many of you have chosen something to give up for Lent, or have chosen to do something new for Lent? Anybody? No? I'm not going to call on you, don't worry. It's kind of nice in some ways to be invited for want to give up eating unhealthy foods so that I become healthier? Maybe. Maybe I should give up coffee, but I usually don't for that. Maybe it's really about God inviting us to see ourselves and to see others, to see the world in the way that God sees. Maybe that's part of the journey through Lent to the cross. Maybe that is the part of the dying that we're invited into before the rebirth can happen in our lives. Maybe there are old stories that are coming to an end, just waiting to come to an end. Old ideas about ourselves and who we are. Maybe there's some old relationships that have been imprisoning us or that we've been imprisoning other people through unforgiveness. And we need to release them. We need to forgive them. We need to let go. Do we see others the way that God sees us? Do we see ourselves the way that God sees us? Then we come back to light. Jesus says, I am the light of the world. Those who follow me shall not walk in darkness. And then in Matthew chapter 5, Jesus turns to his disciples and he says, guess what? You are the light of the world. That would knock me over. That knocked me out of my chair to hear that. You are the light of the world. I am the light of the world. What is this about? But you see, the thing with light is that we all need light to see, right? So Jesus is the light of the world. We see Jesus. That's part of the gospel, is that we get to see the light of the glory of God in the face of Christ, according to Apostle Paul. But light also gives us the ability to see through. Through light, we can actually see the world more clearly. So this passage from Genesis 45 is interesting because it's really about a couple of things. One, this passage invites us to ask the question, how do we see our lives? How do we see our world? How do we see our relationships through the light of God in Christ Jesus? How do we see? The second part is that this passage shows us is that forgiveness is a pretty big deal. That forgiveness, something is actually happening that has to do with history. It has to do with the past. It has to do with the present. And it has to do with the future. So when we forgive, we see others the way God sees them. We see ourselves the way God sees us. And we also see the past and the present and the future in light of God's plans. Forgiveness. I want you to think for a moment, just to really reflect on this question of how does God see others in my life? So I want you to call to mind, to your awareness for a moment, just one or two people, maybe. One or two people that you really struggle with. One or two people that you have been bound up with, and you realize you have not been able to let go of this particular way of relating with this person. Let's call that to mind for a moment. Try to imagine how God might see this person. Try to imagine seeing this person in their wholeness rather than in their woundedness. Beneath their acts, beneath their acting out, try to imagine this person is whole and redeemed and is beloved of God. Because you see, this is the essence of prayer. This is why Jesus says, love your enemies and pray for them. Pray for your enemies. Sometimes I wonder, like, why does he say that? Why pray for my enemies? Is that going to change anything? Am I going to change my enemy by praying for them? I don't get it. It doesn't necessarily make sense. Then I wonder, well, what happens if you do? What happens if you have the audacity and the commitment to pray for your enemies? What would happen if every day for 5 minutes you prayed good and you prayed healing and you prayed love and acceptance and blessing and God's bounty for that person? Do you see? Would your picture of them in your mind's eye begin to change as you pray for them? Would your heart open up? Would you start to feel some compassion? How does God see them? That seems to be the central question of the Gospels, isn't it? Look at how Jesus interacts with the untouchables in the Gospels. The lepers, the tax collectors, the sinners, the prostitutes, the people that are discarded and invisible to a large part from greater society. How does God see them? The second question is, how do we learn to see ourselves the way that God sees us? You know, there's this sense in Scripture, echoed in the Gospels and in Paul's letters, that when God sees us, when God sees you, God actually sees Christ. I want to let that resonate for a minute. When God sees you, God sees Christ. God doesn't see someone who is unredeemed and unredeemable. God doesn't see someone in whom there is no hope. God doesn't see your small story. God doesn't see the narratives and the voices and the tapes that play over and over again that bring shame and fear and anxiety. God sees you in your wholeness. God sees you in your freedom. God sees you as an heir to the kingdom, as a child, God's child. And in the same way, God invites us to see others. So there's a direct connection between how God sees us and how we see others, brothers and sisters. My hunch, my sense, is that in this story of Joseph, we're encountering somebody who gives us an example of the way to forgiveness. You see, Joseph was given a lot of gifts as a child. He was the favorite. He was Dad's favorite. You know, he had the, remember Justin talking about the Technicolor Dreamcoat a little bit. He got the special coat. He got all the favors and blessings. He was the youngest, or one of the youngest. Benjamin was the youngest. But he was the favorite. He was a dreamer. He was maybe a little full of himself as a young man and had these interpreted as dreams as his brothers worshiping and bowing down to him and that sort of thing. His brothers didn't like that, and they threw him into a pit, left him for dead, abandoned him. And he was picked up by slave traders and carried off to Egypt, right? He spent years in prison in the dungeons in the basement of the palace. And you know the story. But listen to this. I am your brother Joseph. Talk about a family reunion. It's likely that Joseph is about 39 years old. A couple of years younger than me, I hate to say. And he is at the top of his game. He's been given everything. He is now ruler over all of Pharaoh's household. It's hard to emphasize his status at this point. He says, I am your brother, the one you sold in Egypt. He is acknowledging the transgression. He's acknowledging the wound that has been caused by his brothers. There is trauma in Joseph's life. And now he is going through a process of healing and reconciliation. He's taking care of the unfinished business of his past. He says, do not be distressed because the brothers are freaking out. They're in a pretty vulnerable state. There's famine in the land. And they are actually appealing to the high court, essentially, to get provisions that they need. And lo and behold, it is their brother that they abandoned for dead. So they are distressed. And he says, do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here. God, do not be angry with yourselves. Talk about a word of compassion. And he says, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. It was for this bigger picture that God worked through you. It was for this larger story that God enabled this broken, wounding relationship in our past. There's famine. 5 more years of famine. But God sent me ahead of you to preserve for you, to preserve for the people of Israel a remnant on earth. God sent me ahead of you through your abuse and your abandonment of me in this pit. He's to save lives by a great deliverance. By a great deliverance. So then it was not you who sent me here. It was not you who sent me here, but God. You see, forgiving gives us new eyes. Forgiving helps us to see underneath the small stories that clamor for our attention. The stories of human divisiveness and harm we can cause each other. The important stories of trauma and abuse, neglect and abandon that we experience. That beneath all of that, God. Do you see? Lent is an invitation for you to see God's story through your life. To see the way that God transforms the barriers into boundaries. And I say that because it's really important. We all have barriers. We all have developed walls and armor to protect ourselves, to keep others out, to defend ourselves from the enemy, which we sometimes need, and sometimes we don't. But through forgiveness, God transforms those barriers into boundaries. And what I like about this passage is that Joseph didn't say, oh, come on into my house, we're going to have dinner, and you guys are going to live with me and bunk up in my room. His brothers and his family caused tragedy and trauma in his life. Things don't go back to business as usual in some fantasy past. There's a fierce honesty in this passage that allows Joseph to create space and to offer freedom while maintaining boundaries. And so you see, this is part of forgiveness in our own lives. That when we forgive, when we release someone from the past, we're not giving in, we're not condoning the injury and the trauma, the abuse, the neglect, the anxiety. We're not condoning that. But we are surrounding ourselves with that divine boundary that comes from knowing who we are and from knowing whose we are. Once we understand and see ourselves as part of that bigger story, as part of God's plan, all those smaller stories of wounding and hurt take on new meaning. We can finally release that which is keeping us stuck in those old narratives, and we can open ourselves to a new story that God is writing in our lives now. So making peace with our past helps us to say yes to the big story. The big story that is always there. It's a spacious seeing, and it gives us permission to see other people as they are. I think this quote might be one of the great quotes about the why of forgiveness. The real source of forgiveness here. The eye through which I see God is the same eye through which God sees me. Think about that for a moment. That will rattle the cage. My eye and God's eye are one eye, one seeing, one knowing, one love. This is called practicing the presence of God, brothers and sisters. It is allowing God to be present in and through our lives, and that happens through forgiveness. It happens most beautifully through forgiveness. So I have one invitation for you this Lent. You are the light of the world. You are the light of the world. I want to invite you to practice seeing others through the rest of Lent. To see others not in the stories and the identities that we've created for them, not in the familiar patterns that we've gotten stuck in, but to practice seeing others in their wholeness, in their belovedness by God, in the larger story that God is inviting them to live. To practice seeing them from that place. And one thing you might do is actually spend a little time, just a few minutes, 5 minutes or so, in prayer every day. And let somebody show up in your mind's eye that is especially difficult for you right now. It's especially difficult relationship. Pray for that person. And just, you might keep a journal if you're a journaler or something like that, but just notice, if you stick to that every single day through Easter, just notice what happens in your relationship to